Hey, welcome everyone. So this is the first episode of my Blather brain series called What is the Matrix? Now, you've probably heard a lot of people talk about recently about the Matrix, and if you don't know, which I imagine most of you do know, but if you don't know, the Matrix is a movie about futuristic AI robots using growing human beings for energy, right? They're using humans as an energy source, right? And in a similar way, right, the ruling class, the elites of this planet, are using methods, systems to control the slave class, right? So that's what people are talking about when they talk about the Matrix, right? These systems of control, just like in the movie The Matrix, right? The machines are using, right, the Matrix, this software, this virtual world, as a means of control of the human race, right? And it's not too far off from the real thing, of course. And really, if you want to think about it, it's it's a more updated, Plato's allegory of the cave, right? These shadow puppets and prisoners, all they can see are the shadows, right? They think they know what's going on, but they really don't. And I think this is actually more accurate to what we're talking about with the Matrix, because really we're talking about Plato's allegory of the cave, because what you think is reality is not in fact reality. So I want you to keep that in mind. So I'm going to kind of go off on an aside and mention something else, which is kind of corollary. So, you've definitely heard people say, this new thing, it's Orwellian, that's Orwellian, right? Right. Orwellian. Of course, that's referring to George Orwell's 1984. In this, right, supposedly fictional world of Oceania, right, the nation of Oceania, the Big Brother, of course, uses many methods of control. But the one that the author, George Orwell, kind of hits upon is language. So, in fact, the main character, Winston Smith's co-worker or friend in the Ministry of Truth, he works on the Newspeak dictionary. So, right, Newspeak is the new English language. So, what is this? How does this Newspeak look like? Right? Is this new English? Right? They're creating new words, and in fact, yes, they do work on creating new words, but this co-worker, will say, mentions that more than making up words, the trick is getting rid of words. So you may say, well, what's the point? So let's take addition, okay? Let's say you're going to the store, there's 2 apples and 2 apples, right? But you don't have a word for addition. And you can intuitively understand that, right? You grab 2 apples and you grab another 2 apples, now you have 4, right? But saying and is not quite equivalent to adding, right? It's not quite the same as addition or even subtraction for that sake. If it's like 2 and 2, it's like, well, are you dividing that, right? So there's 2 aspects of this with language, right? There's the aspect of communication, right? If the definition of addition isn't very widely known, or people aren't familiar with the idea of addition or subtraction or multiplication or division, right? Arithmetic, we can't communicate. And of course, even that communication relies on you actually knowing the rules of arithmetic. But even if you yourself, let's say you're a savant in this world, right? In this fictional world without addition. So the thing is, as smart as you may be, not having the words for addition and subtraction, that's going to severely limit your ability to think about these ideas. Right? So this is kind of the idea that you can't talk about ideas if you don't have the words to describe them, right? Even if you're building up to one idea, even what I'm doing right now, right? What is the Matrix? Really what I'm doing is where I'm taking the word matrix and I'm explaining, right? I'm using many words, right? I'm using many words to describe a single idea so that, when you communicate, when others talk to you about the matrix, you have an understanding, right? So this is kind of what I'm talking about, right? You need words to describe ideas. Well, you don't, the ideas themselves don't necessarily need conscious language. We'll say that's kind of what I was saying with the apples. Maybe you can understand, 2 and 2, but if you want formalized systems, and even more importantly, if you want to communicate with other people, well, they're gonna have to understand this. You're gonna have to somehow transmit that idea to another person, right? You're gonna have to, we'll say, brain sync. You're gonna have to somehow get the idea in your head and put it into someone else's. And how do you do that? Well, that's language, and that's kind of, we'll say, the magic. Of course, this magic can be used for good. It can be used for evil, and it can be used for control. So I mentioned the importance of words, and in reducing words, right, which is the kind of method that's being used, right? I was talking about this fictionally in 1984, but this is the same tool used in our world, right? Reducing language, and occasionally changing language, right? Occasionally adding words, but mostly reducing words, right? And so what's the point? So there's another aspect of language, right? So language is right, is comprised of words, but ultimately the whole point is to describe stories. And even people that want to call themselves objective scientists like this, ultimately they rely on stories to explain phenomena that they see. Okay, so really what's going on is, there's the control of words, but what I'm saying is that the control of words is for the purposes of controlling narratives, right? If you can control the words, you can control the kinds of narratives that are told, right? More complicated words, you can describe more complicated narratives. More simple words, you can describe more simple narratives, right? You can't describe complicated narratives with simple words, right? So, and this is what I'm getting at. So I'm going to mention, I have 2 examples for narratives, simple narratives that you've heard before. Okay. So I want you to think about this because, so the first one is, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Okay. So at least here in the West, or, the United States at least, this is we'll say, common wisdom, right? But really what that means is that this is accepted advice, or accepted knowledge, right? That, of course, in this, remember I was talking about the language, it all hinges on these implicit understandings. So again, breakfast is the most important meal, right? At least here in the U.S., right? 3 meals a day. Again, another one of these things, another narrative. But see, this narrative relies on this other narrative. But so what's the story here, right? That if you don't have breakfast, you're gonna have a bad day. You take breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and breakfast is superordinate to both lunch and to dinner, right? So when you're thinking about eating for the day, you want to prioritize, right? So this is the magic, this is the power of narratives, right? I'm going to use narrative language. It shapes behavior, right? If you have a good story, if you have a cogent, comprehensible story, this will it will influence people's behaviors, right? In fact, it's even more effective if it's in the subconscious, right? So, there's some things that, you hear slogans or catchy tunes for certain ads, but, you're aware of it in the sense that, like, okay, well, let's say, okay, I'm looking for whatever product, right? And you're thinking about it. Maybe you may think about the slogan, but then you have to consciously analyze, okay, well, that's just a slogan. Are their products or services really, are they really up to par, or is that just advertising, right? But it's even more nefarious. Oh, well, it's even deeper when these narratives are in the subconscious, right? Because you can't. So when you think about, let's say your patterns for the day, right? You may think, okay, well, I'm gonna eat breakfast. I'm gonna wake up. I'm gonna eat breakfast, right? You don't think, okay, this is a slogan. There's an advertisement. It's just we'll say in just mainstream, right? Just mainstream wisdom. So I'm going to get into my next narrative, which I was talking about before. A lot of times with these narratives, they're attached, right? They're connected to all the other narratives, right? So this other narrative is cholesterol will clog up your veins and give you a heart attack, right? And again, this is connected to another story that fats and meats are high in cholesterol, right? So we have these two narratives, these two stories, right? We have the story of breakfast is the most important meal. So, that's going to shape your behavior and say, okay, well, you better eat breakfast, right? Or you're going to have a bad day, right? Isn't it? So I'm going to eat breakfast. So I have all these different options, right? I have Frosted Flakes or I have bacon and eggs. Oh, what's that? Oh, that's right. Cholesterol will clog your veins and give you a heart attack. Oh, so if you eat the bacon and eggs, it's going to give me a heart attack. Right? Well, perfect, right? There's Frosted Flakes in the cereal aisle. Okay. So I kind of went through this I kind of went through these narratives to explain that these are the foremost weapon of the ruling class. This is the foremost weapon of the Matrix. If you can control words, if you can control narratives, you can control the way people think. Okay, so this is the thesis. I should have really brought this up at the beginning, but there it is. If you can control language, you can control thoughts. If you can control thoughts, you can control behavior. Okay, because people might think, I'm not saying people think this, but maybe there's people that think this. They're like, oh, it's Orwellian. They're not like, they want us to eat the bugs. They want to sell, they just keep pushing cereal or whatever. And, for those of you that know, right, there's a topic of seed oils. There's a topic of sugar, right, fructose. I'm not going to get into that now, but for those of you that know about these things, and it's not so much the fact that, let's say, grocery stores are conspiring to just stock up on a bunch of on cereal, and of course I'm not even mentioning government subsidies for certain crops. Like what I'm trying to say, with this thesis that there's a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different methods of control, right? But of course, the primary way of control is before any of that, you get into people's heads, right? You get into people's heads with stories. You get into people's heads with narratives. And of course, the simpler they are, the more likely they are to diffuse, the more likely they are to become mainstream. And indeed, I kind of forgot where I heard this. Maybe it was 1984. Maybe it was somewhere else. Maybe, someone tell me in the comments if you know. But something along the lines of sanity, right? That's not something I believe, but sanity is just a majority, right? In the sense that it's kind of a pessimistic view. But the point is that I understand. Actually, I think it was O'Brien in 1984. But the point is that if we'll say 99% of people say that there's no squirrel, you see a squirrel, 99% of people say they don't see it, right? That's grounds for calling you insane, right? Whether or not the squirrel's real or not, right? So this is kind of what I mean. There is this kind of division between, we'll say, reality and we'll say something along the lines of social acceptance, right? Basically, things that are socially accepted in some sense becomes the truth. And of course, you are crazy if you go against it, right? Even if it's factual in some sense, right? We'll just assume that there is indeed a squirrel. if you happen to see it, like maybe, so here's the thing, maybe you're maybe everyone is right. This was the foremost example. Maybe everyone's blind. Maybe everyone's in the cave, and they've all seen a shadow puppets, right? I guess at a certain point, if you can get that narrative, that shadow puppet narrative across, right, in Plato's cave, right, they're gonna call you crazy. Of course, that's because, right, they can't see it. Now this is not supposed to be like a hot take or anything about this, but what I'm saying is that, you know, what are these shadow puppets? Like I said, the shadow puppets are these narratives, right? These stories, and like I said, the simpler they are, the more effective they are, the more they will disseminate, and the more people accept them, the greater the power of these narratives are, right? So this would be 3 meals a day. How pervasive is that idea? And I especially want you to think about these two things. Where did these stories come from, right? I mean, like I said, that's what I was talking about. You know, there's certain advertisement campaigns, right? If you hear these advertisement campaigns, you're like, okay, well, that's just an advertisement campaign, right? They're trying to get me to buy something, and you can understand some implicit biases there. But with these narratives that you can't even pinpoint the origin, right? That's a little harder, right? That's a little harder to pinpoint where that comes from and the intention of the people who put those narratives together. And maybe why it's even more effective is the fact that you think, right? You think that this is some sort of common wisdom. You think, okay, no, it's not some sort of top on down narrative. It's an organic narrative, right? From people's experiences. But what I'm here to tell you is that, in fact, most of what you see, right, we're talking about what is the Matrix. Most of how you think things work is not how they work. Okay? There's a lot of these things, and a lot of you probably already know this, and you might laugh, right? But it's a lot of these things, like, we'll say, you know, you, again, here's a narrative, right? You get your money, you put it into a bank, and they keep it in a vault, right? That's not, spoiler alert, that's not how it works, okay? And this is what I mean. There's all of these narratives that seem to describe how things work, and maybe they are organic, right? But ultimately, these narratives, these words are tools to keep you in the matrix. Because as long as you don't see the code, right, as long as you don't see the source code, right, you'll never be able to break out of it. If you can't see the matrix for what it is, which is, right, arbitrary, it's not actually, in fact, it's not just arbitrary, it's false. It actually doesn't... It's not, that's the whole point. It's not reality, right? It's fake, and that's kind of the point here. That most of what you think is real. You think, okay, that's real. This must be real. That's real. It's not real, okay? Because there's these narratives that, again, where do they come from? And again, that's a very important question. Where did they come from? And in fact, the most powerful ones are the ones that you can't even pinpoint. That's the most effective ones. In fact, actually, I hadn't prepared for this, but it kind of reminds me of the movie Inception, right? There's you know, the whole point of Inception, right? How do you incept an idea into someone? Of course, this whole problem that the characters talk about. You know, if you want to put an idea into someone, if you really want to plant an idea into someone, you have to remove the origin of where it came from, right? If I tell you to do something, I guess the example that uses elephants. If I tell you don't think about elephants, right, you're going to be thinking about elephants. But the important thing is, that's not an idea you had. You know that I put it there, right? But if you think that you came up with it, or you think that, let's say, the herd, the mass, have you know, the mass wisdom has kind of put this together through mass experience, you're automatically going to give that more credibility, right? Because you don't think you're being manipulated. In fact, now that I'm really thinking about it, that's another theme of the Matrix, that, like, the whole point of, let's say, we eventually find, again, spoiler alert, but the architect of the Matrix goes out and says that, you know, the only reason there's survivors, you know, in the city of Zion is because it's the illusion of choice is better for control, right? Very interesting, right? So these narratives, all of these, I guess what I'm trying to say, all these narratives, these are brain parasites. Okay, each nugget is a parasite, and indeed, they're, like I was kind of mentioning, they're connected to each other. It's not just one narrative getting you to buy, you know, high sugar Frosted Flakes, right? It doesn't just end like that. It's a whole string of these narratives, right? And actually, as it turns out, you remove one of these parasites, and these brain parasites, and other brain parasites come out with it, right? So in fact, this actually was the beginning of this episode, was me thinking about this phrase, breakfast, most important meal of the day. Now, as I've learned things, right, as I've tried to open my eyes to certain things, that this is just something that, like, when I revisited this narrative, I was like, well, this is nonsense, and I didn't deliberately have to remove this brain parasite, right? So this kind of thing that for everyone's different. It's different for what kind of brain parasites they need to remove. Again, an example would be like seed oils and sugar. Usually if you know about the dangers of seed oils, you know about the dangers of fructose, right? It goes hand in hand, but which one are you going to remove? Like, which was the impetus for removing these correlated narratives, these correlated brain parasites? Well, that's different person to person, and you hear a lot, like these people are just bots, there's just NPCs, and I guess really what I'm trying to say is that even for those of us who want to leave the matrix, who want to leave this fake world, who seek truth, we'll say. I mean, maybe that sounds a little too romantic here, but for those of us who care about the truth, right? Or you have to understand that before we got there, we too subscribe to these narratives, and maybe there was a kernel of doubt, right? But ultimately, there was a time where we went along with these narratives, and I guess there's some things I shouldn't say on YouTube, but there's it might sound a little effeminate, but the reality is, in some sense, it's cause for compassion to consider that that people who are trapped in the matrix, like you were just trapped in the matrix. Although I think they make a good point in the matrix, which is the fact that, well, for the people still plugged into the matrix, right, they're still part of the system, right? They will fight you. Right, they will fight you to maintain that lie. So even if right, the whole goal is to free yourself from this, and maybe perhaps free the people that you care about, maybe in some greater goal to free all of humanity, right? You have to understand that for everyone that's still hooked into these narratives, I would suggest caution there. Right, I wouldn't suggest going out to people and saying, "Oh, seed oils," and maybe that's more effective, but than other maybe it's easier to take out that brain parasite than other ones, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. There's some brain parasites that are looser than others, right, and they go along, right, kind of with bad habits, right. An example would be something like Linux. You start using Linux, you're going to open yourself up to a world of free software, right, and maybe that opens you up to new paradigms. Let's say one would be a command line interface. Now you can have a command line interface on proprietary systems. In fact, you do, right? But the entire system is not optimized for that, right? It's meant for GUI. What you see is what you get. And so my only point here is that obviously some habits are correlated with other habits, right? So you start using Linux, you start using the command line, you start doing things from the command line instead of having to rely on a GUI. And maybe you garner yourself some efficiency by doing that, right? But let's say that habit of using the command line, that came with the habit of using Linux. So let's say of using free software. Again, is there, in some sense, it's kind of coincidence. In some sense, it's also not, right? If you really think about it, like why is Libre software? Why is it correlated? With let's say these we'll even say micro optimizations. Maybe people would view as small optimizations, or using terminal based programs with the keyboard and things like this. Okay, so again, maybe it's a mystery, but maybe it's not actually. Maybe it's the fact that of course this is, I haven't read this book, but the Cathedral and the Bazaar. Maybe it's kind of one of these things where Linux being the bazaar that it is, right? That there's all this diversity. There's all this diversity of software, and there's all these different paradigms, right? And just even having that Libre software background, right? Kind of opens you up to these different ways of doing things, right? So there we go. You're not committed to this one habit of clicking and dragging and etc. Right? So, this is kind of an obvious thing that about habits being correlated with other habits. But this is kind of how it is with brain parasites. Brain parasites are connected with other brain parasites, and in fact, they're so deep that you might getting rid of one, you might get rid of 4 other ones, and you look back later and you see, let's say, this, like I said, this brain parasite of yours, you came out with 4 other ones, and let's say number 4 you got rid of, and you don't even consciously remember you getting rid of that one. You look at someone else and they have brain parasite 4, right? Or let's say not even someone, you just remember that there is brain parasite 4, and you're like, okay, I never consciously got rid of that, but you look back like, dang, that was in my head, right? This is, I keep using Matrix analogies, but that's the whole point of the episode, right? There's Neo, he gets bugged by the agents, right? Spoiler again. I guess this entire episode's a spoiler, by the way. Honestly, if you haven't seen the Matrix, I don't know what you're doing. And if I spoiled it, it's almost like, well, good, because that's the whole point. Like, if it's spoiled for you, it shouldn't be spoiled. Like, you should already know this. Is kind of what I'm saying. They bug Neo, right, with this like alien looking bug like AI whatever right inside of him, and they have, right, the human rebels will say they have to extract this from Neo. They have to extract from his stomach or whatever. I guess it is kind of the same thing, because, right, his him being the Matrix, it's a virtual representation of himself. It's his mind, right? So really, what they're doing is removing this bug from his mind, and that's what you need to do, right? Maybe that would be the thumbnail of this video, even. These parasites of the mind, because the parasites of the mind are the most detrimental, right? There's a lot of parasitism, I think that's how you say it, but there's a lot of these, this parasitic activities going on. You can there's a lot, of course, and I'll mention it in other episodes, ways in which your life force is being sucked out of you, right? And so in the ones that you're aware of, right, you can feel one way or the other, or whatever. People have different reactions to these kinds of systems of control, right? But the ones that you can't fight are the ones that are in your mind. And what I mean, I'm not trying to be black, but what I'm saying is that if you're not aware of something if you're not aware of certain shackles, they're all the more heavier. Okay? If you have this illusion of freedom, if you don't understand certain chains holding you back, you're going to be confused as to why you can't move, right? So that's kind of what I'm pointing out, and this is the foremost one, right? Like I said, it's not so much Frosted Flakes selling to stores hundreds and hundreds, and just it's not just a mere corruption, we'll say, of like I said, I'm not even talking about subsidies here. I'm not even talking about government subsidies, right? That's a method of control, we'll say, in the agricultural space. Well, what I'm saying, like, it doesn't end there, right? Because the example would be like, well, if people were like, if people didn't buy into this whole narrative of grains, right? People didn't buy into this whole narrative of breakfast, of this whole narrative of cholesterol. Again, if you're still a breakfast enjoyer, okay, I'm not trying to in this case, I'm not trying to poop on you. I think, for example, again, what were we talking about before, right? Addition versus saying and, right? All these terms. The importance of words is that they provide nuance, right? So a lot of things are like that, right? It's not like, okay, it's not just these simple narratives like, oh, it's just like this is good, this is bad, and like everything, right, is, everything's going to be like this. Some things are like that, right? Some things are good and evil, but a lot of things, in fact, are nuanced, right? To eat breakfast or not to eat breakfast. Well, what I'm saying is that if when you have these brain parasites, when you have these narratives in your mind, right, these controlling narratives, it doesn't matter if something's a good decision or not. You're always going to make a bad decision with these brain parasites. That's kind of my point. So this whole thing of eating breakfast and I gotta get the Frosted Flakes, it starts way before the subsidies, because that's kind of the whole point. If people, let's say people didn't subscribe to this breakfast and Kellogg's, people just wouldn't buy it, right? And of course, well, okay, fine, the government would have to subsidize more and et cetera, okay, maybe, right? But then that's a lot harder, and this kind of the message of the Matrix. It is easier to control when things make sense to people, right? If it makes sense to people, if people think they have freedom, it's like, well, like, no, I don't think there's a method of control, like the farmers are just providing stuff that I eat, right? So this is kind of what I mean. Like it's easier to control people as to belligerently confront them and say, no, you will eat this, right? No, of course, this is the whole message of you will own nothing and be happy, right? That you can't merely be shackled. You have to love your shackles, or better yet, not even realize the shackles, right? That's the foremost way to do it. And so your homework, I'm giving you homework. So in the comments below, I want you to talk about brain parasites that you've gotten rid of, right? Of course, you can't talk about ones that you haven't gotten rid of yet, but I want you to, so basically these parasites that I'm mentioning are this conventional wisdom will say that really there's no challenging to it. These narratives that you hear that have proven to be wrong, right? That have proven to be detrimental to your freedom, right? And freedom, okay, is what there's a discussion on that. What is freedom, right? And I'll talk about that, I imagine, in a later episode. But basically, these I guess that's what I'm asking you to list. Brain parasites that you've gotten rid of. Of course, if they're still in there, you obviously are not able to mention it. So maybe someone you read a comment about something that you're like, what? That's a little crazy. Again, what did I talk about before? Right. Well, actually, I've done a couple takes, so if I repeat myself sometimes, I apologize because I can't remember which take I mentioned what. But this whole thing of sanity, right? This is the group think defines sanity. I think this is a idea from O'Brien in 1984. Right, that sanity is defined by numbers, right? This is not my idea. I don't agree with this, but there's some sense in which, if the group thinks a certain way, you're the maniac, of course. Like, everyone's blind and you can see squirrels and trees and all things like this. Well, you're a madman, right? You're describing creatures that can't be detected, right? Or you're out of right, or even better yet, right? You're outside of Plato's cave, right? Everyone has seen shadow puppets. They think, and that's the whole point, most of what they know is their entire lives is wrong. Well, they think they know what's going on, but because you're contradicting what they've been seeing, obviously you're a madman, right? You have to, and of course it makes sense, right? You have to be a madman. Most people see the same thing except for you. What's wrong with you, right? So in fact, this is maybe that's a reaction you want to look for. Of course, there is some lunacy, perhaps, in the comments, but like, if there's something that strikes you, like, oh, really? Like, what are you talking about? What are you on about, right? Maybe it would behoove you to look into it, and that's kind of my point, right? Not just to blindly go into narratives. Look into it. Look for it for yourself, right? If you want to get out of Plato's cave, if you want to get out of the Matrix, you have to leave, right? You have to walk. You have to will yourself out of it. You cannot be led by the nose out of it. Okay. That's kind of the point. So that's your homework. Comment down below these brain parasites you've encountered in your life. Other than that, thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks.